Hello, and welcome to the ARENA webinar, Outcomes-Based Intelligence, the new standard for workforce impact. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a few administrative details to share with you, and then I will turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, we would like to thank ARENA for their partnership with today's event. They have been a wonderful partner to Argyle and are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. So thank you again to ARENA. We appreciate you joining us today. You can also find them online at arena.io. We also welcome you to stay socially connected during today's event. So for those of you who are active on social media, please use the hashtag ArgyleDigital and follow us at Argyle Exec Forum. Also be sure to follow Argyle on LinkedIn for special announcements. Finally, and most importantly, we would love to hear from you, so please submit all questions that come up during today's event into the chat section of the interface. Following the discussion, we have set aside time for our speaker to weigh in on your questions. Now, without further delay, I would love to introduce our speaker, Michael Rosenbaum, founder and CEO at Arena. We're excited to have Michael with us for this exciting session. So welcome, Michael, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brittany, and thank you to the Argyle team for having me and for your partnership in this. My name is Mike Rosenbaum, and as Brittany said, I'm the founder and CEO of Arena. And today we were going to talk. I wanted to talk about HR and artificial intelligence as it applies to labor markets. And it's a topic which I'm sure you hear a ton about. I think it's important to understand the broader context behind the relationship between artificial intelligence and workforces and labor markets, to understand where it came from, and to understand why it is this is such a transformatively different moment, and how to think about exploring the power of these technologies in your workforce and in labor markets writ large. So HR technology has been around for a long time, and it has in general overpromised and underdelivered. And artificial intelligence has also been around for a long time. It did not start with ChatGPT. The idea of using outcomes to teach models and teach computers how to predict things has been around for a long time. But we're at a moment now in the evolution of these technologies where the convergence of artificial intelligence and workforces, artificial intelligence in labor markets, enables things that really haven't been possible before. And the adoption of them enables things that haven't been possible before. So in order to understand why, I think it's important to understand what it is that drives AI. And AI is about using something that happens in the world and an ongoing thing that happens in the world to teach a computer, to teach models how to predict things. And those predictions can show up in lots of different ways. They can show up in ways of predicting what a potential employee is going to do. If they're in a particular situation, it can predict the appropriate next sentence in a paragraph, which is what you see in large language models and something like ChatGPT. But at its core, it is about outcomes and events, teaching models to make predictions. And sometimes that fact is lost when we talk about AI and HR tech. We talk about all kinds of sort of shallower things, but at its core, it's the fact that we know what someone does in a particular job at a particular moment under a particular manager on a particular shift. We know what happens to that person over time in a given workforce. We know what happens in someone's career. And we know it in pretty deep levels by thinking about sort of the systems that run an organization. And it's those outcomes that really are the key to making predictions. As AI has driven a bunch of adoption of a range of technologies in our workforces, that piece is sometimes lost. And so things like the kind of information you get online, like LinkedIn, can tell you whether or not someone started a job and finished a job. But what they can't tell you is someone's behavior in the job. But that information exists in the world, and the current state of artificial intelligence allows us to think about that, and allows us to use that in a bunch of very powerful ways. So that is sort of the core of today's session. So I do want to talk about outcomes as the gold standard in this, how to think about exploring the outcomes that are training a model that you might be using to make certain workforce decisions. And I also want to think about the next step of the implications of that. So AI itself is changing how our labor markets work pretty significantly. They are rapidly creating and destroying jobs and careers and industries. You may hear about things like junior professional services jobs, like accountants and lawyers, being replaced by AI very quickly. That's an example of the way in which just the way this technology has evolved over the last few months and couple of years has very rapidly shifted what jobs are being hired for and what jobs are being destroyed. And the other thing that's happened recently that's accelerated some of this is changes in federal policy. So the way that federal policy has shifted over the last 12 months has had impacts on which industries are growing, which industries are shrinking, which careers are growing, which industries are shrinking. And the power of artificial intelligence applied to workforces lets us think about how we reduce the friction of folks moving from shrinking parts of the economy to growing parts of the economy in a way that's important to understand as employers. It's important to understand as those managing workforces. And if we can harness those technologies in the right way, we can leap ahead of our competition in thinking about sort of how to build the most productive, effective workforces. And the last piece that I wanted to make sure that we covered today is the elephant in the room, which is bias in AI. So there are lots of conversations about bias in AI. There's lots of fear about bias in AI, but AI also has the opportunity to reduce bias. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how those technologies work, how we measure how much they work, how we measure the outcomes associated with the ways in which AI can increase bias or reduce bias, and how artificial intelligence itself can actually help us comply with the rules that manage how we hire and reduce some of the biases that move even beyond those rules that in general we want to be reducing. So with that, today this question of how do we predict is at its core how we make a hiring decision. So so today we look at a resume. We may try to assess for skills in some way. And we may assess for skills based on what someone already knows how to do. So that could be an experience they had in the past. That could be an assessment product we use to try to assess those skills. But all of those are rapidly being overtaken by AI, and AI on the part of a job applicant. So, today AI can write a resume. Today AI can get ahead of identifying keywords and can create a stylized resume that is speaking to the AI that you might be running to evaluate who to evaluate. Um, and um, and so that creates a crisis in how the job market itself works. And that crisis exists at the same time as labor markets are being thrown in the air. As I mentioned before, the fact that AI is very rapidly transitioning our labor markets and the fact that federal policy is very rapidly transitioning our labor markets makes this matching problem even more important. And the matching problem, when it's being driven by AI, and AI at its simplest level, so keystrokes, or keywords rather, it makes it difficult for us to figure out sort of who to put in which role. And that doesn't help anybody. So it obviously doesn't help us as employers to figure out who to hire, where to put someone. And it also doesn't help a job seeker who is really looking for a place where they can be happy and successful. And so the implications of this at an organization level are obviously dramatic. The increased churn that occurs or the reduced productivity that occurs when we put the wrong person in the wrong seat um, costs a lot. It costs a lot in terms of time. It costs a lot in terms of money. It costs a lot in terms of our customer relationships. And so solving this problem is incredibly important in the very near term. And it's also important in the longer term as we think about the ways in which our organizations are transforming through these changes in our economy. When changes in federal policy or evolution in AI technologies means that there are industries shrinking and industries growing and careers shrinking and careers growing, being able to route folks into the right place and to use actual outcomes in order to train those models correctly is the key to solving that problem. But there's so much noise around the technology that it's hard to figure out when it's actually working. So, with that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about how I came to this kind of work. So, before I started companies that address the world of work and transform the world of work, I was an academic. So, I taught economics and law at Harvard. I was a fellow, so the step before assistant professor. This was the late 90s, and while I did that, I did work for the Clinton White House, originally around technology policy and then around labor issues. And the Clinton administration was building a cluster. I do know that I've just dated myself, but forgive me for that. So the Clinton administration was building a cluster of policies around where there were untapped economic opportunities, particularly in underinvested communities. And they built a cluster of policies that were anchored by something known as the Empowerment Zone program. The Empowerment Zone program essentially encouraged retail to grow in underinvested communities. So Walmart and 7-Eleven took significant advantage of these policies. And I disagreed with them. I said it may be true that an underinvested community is an untapped retail market, but the bigger opportunity in an underinvested community is that it's an untapped talent market. It's an untapped talent market because the market for talent is based on resumes. Resumes correlate with socioeconomic background and race and gender, but they're not necessarily great predictors of success in a job. And my field was empirical labor economics. So I said, if you could apply large amounts of data to that problem, you could do a better job of matching people with the jobs they'd be best in. Organizations would get more productive and better talent, and everyone would be happy. And the response was the folks who came up with the other idea are more famous than you are. We're going with them. So I lost the argument. I went back to academia. My academic advisor said, I think you want to do this more than write about it. You should go do it. And so I moved to Baltimore because it was a post-industrial city that had two large private employers, GM and Bethlehem Steel, and their employment bases were down by 95%. And folks who had been working in those industries had middle-income jobs, um, and those jobs didn't exist anymore. And so the jobs that were growing were largely tech and healthcare. But folks had trouble moving into tech and healthcare jobs for a whole range of reasons. And so I started a company called Catalyte, which became one of the largest tech apprenticeship platforms in the US. And that business used what today you would describe as simple AI to predict the likelihood that someone would be in the top 2% of all software engineers after they learn to be a software engineer. And then we would point that technology at folks who were cobbling together lower income jobs, identify folks, and then train folks to be software engineers and move folks into software engineering jobs. Scaled that business up pretty significantly. And while I was doing that, the nugget of what became Arena came about. And that came from I was at a cocktail party and I met an executive at a hospital. The executive asked me what I did, and I told her. And she said, I don't think we're very good at hiring. And I said, why don't you think you're good at hiring? And she said, well, we turn over a lot of staff, and our junior staff look a lot different than our senior staff. And so it feels to me like something's wrong. Do you think you could help us? And I said, I know a lot about tech jobs, but I don't know about healthcare jobs or hospitality jobs or skilled trades jobs or retail jobs or any of the other jobs that exist in a healthcare provider. And she said, we'll be an early customer. So if you think you can figure it out. So we signed up that hospital and a handful of other hospitals in a long-term care facility. And we put a team on solving the problem of twofold. One is, can you build a piece of technology that predicts the likelihood that someone will stay longer in a particular job, under a particular manager, on a particular shift in a particular location? And second, can you deliver that information to the hiring managers and the other constituents inside of that organization so they make a different decision so that you can actually measure a difference in their workforce productivity metrics? The first part was hard, but not that hard. The second part was more challenging. So after a few years, we got it right. We spun it out as an independent business, and the company um, then essentially was a piece of technology that sat behind HR systems. So someone would apply for a job, we would pull data from that system, we would make some predictions, we would push information back into the HR systems, and folks would make different decisions as a result. The company grew that way. And then ChatGPT came out. and it had been that most of our process of meeting a potential customer was explaining what AI is. So, and it would take typically 8 months. Then ChatGPT comes out, and over the course of 2023, we had folks come to us and ask us for other things. So people started saying to us things like, "Could you tell me not just who to hire, but who should I train in what? And could you tell me what happens if I change compensation slightly? And could you tell me if I train this person in this thing, what's their most successful potential career trajectory?" And you have a lot of people who use your platform. Do you know about folks who might live close to my location, who would be happy and successful in a particular role inside my organization, but never thought about it, never thought about us, never thought about this industry, never thought about a given career? So, so in 2024, we relaunched this platform to sit in front of HR systems, or at least beside them, and to make predictions about a whole range of things related to workforce, like not just if I hire this person, will I improve my retention, but who's likely to ghost me? Or what's an appropriate compensation level, and what will happen to my retention if I change compensation by a particular amount? Or how do I think about career pathing both for my employees, even if they're moving across careers inside my organization? And here are folks who may live close by, who we have some outcome information on, who would be likely to be happy and successful in this role, but may never have considered it. So we started scaling that way. And today, on our platform, we have a little over 4.1 million people who use the platform, who've applied for jobs on the platform, who interact with us in some way. We add about 70,000 people a month. In our customer base, our average impact is an improvement of retention, so a reduction of turnover by 21%. Um, and and our models are based on outcomes. So think about integrated with or hooked into the HR systems across the economy. And we have the outcome information. So we know in someone's last job, how much they made, how quickly they got promoted, who they worked for, what shifts they worked, when they transferred, how long they stayed. And we get that on an ongoing basis. And that allows us to make predictions at a very accurate level across the economy. And what it lets us do for folks who use us for retention is we're able to guarantee a 10% retention improvement. And we're able to do it because we're measuring that retention. We've never had a result that bad. And so we're able to come in with a high level of confidence, improve retention, and then make sure that our customers have sort of real-time visibility into that. So part of what we're doing is giving that real-time visibility to our customers. Often HR systems that run sort of HRIS systems are very complicated. It's difficult to pull information out of them. And so we will give a snapshot to our customers of how much they are improving retention by using AI, uh, what their retention numbers actually are, how those retention numbers change, and we're able to do a whole range of things to give a snapshot to our customers of what's going on in particular corners of their organization, in ways that allow them to get in front of those issues. So I want to talk a little bit about bias in AI. And bias in AI there's a very sort of conventional way to think about it, and then there's sort of a big picture way to think about it. So the conventional way to think about it is that AI, because it's trained with the decisions that human beings make, and human beings are biased, means that those biases get embedded into AI systems in ways that hurt us. The second way to think about bias in AI is the biases that we each have, both about ourselves as job seekers and people in our careers, and in terms of how we as hiring managers, or how hiring managers in our organizations might think about bias, both malignant and non-malignant. So malignant would be, I don't want to hire someone because they fall into a particular protected class. Non-malignant would be, well, I think people who go to this school are better than people who go to this other school. So we don't think of the second as malignant a bias, but it's still a bias. And so by using outcomes, we can impact those biases. So I'm going to start by talking about how we address bias uh, in some of the sort of micro decision making. So AI is a prediction. We use outcomes to make predictions. And then what we do is we add another piece of AI on top of that. And another piece of AI on top of it says, I'm going to look at the AI that's running and I'm going to see if I can see anything that correlates with a demographic group. So if I can tell anything demographic or anything in a protected class in your prediction AI, then I'm going to go back and I'm going to tell that the prediction AI to try harder and try again. And we're going to go back and forth until the prediction AI is able to make a prediction where, there is no protected class information in there. The way we're able to do it is that every organization with over 100 employees collects EEOC, i.e. demographic data. We then feed that data into the monitoring AI so that it's able to do that. The other thing that we're able to do is we're able to use the demographic information to test it. So some of you are probably familiar with the EEOC's 4/5 rule. So we're basically monitoring the percentage of each group in an applicant pool, the percentage of each group that are recommended for jobs, and ensuring that those stay within certain bounds so that effectively you can automate compliance with those rules by using a technology like Arena. Um, so there is a broader point, though, which is how bias works in the world writ large. So, as I mentioned, we're a piece of technology that folks will use to improve retention. We're also a piece of technology that folks will use to find new candidates for jobs that are hard to fill, that may not have applied for a job, and may never even considered a career or a job in a particular location. The source for our candidates is threefold. One is we have portals, you know, out there in the world that people can come to, and we say to them, give us some information about yourself and allow us to collect that information, and then make a prediction about who's likely to, whether there's a job that's close to your house where you're going to be happy. The second is we have customers that say, here are candidates that I'm not hiring and I don't really want. Your field, or you are free to route them somewhere else. And um, the third is there are certain places where, if, in effect, we are the front door to the unemployment system. So when someone files for unemployment, they come to us, we give them career guidance and route them into a role. The information that we're collecting is obviously the outcome information I'm talking about. We're collecting any other information that might exist, so open text. And then we're interacting with someone. So we're interacting with someone in a way where we're getting behaviors. So, you know, interact with someone and collect their keystrokes, see how many seconds they pause, how many seconds they look at something, and that gives you behavioral information that you can then tie to an outcome. So those are the sources of folks coming to us where we can route them into a job. Over the last 12 months, there have been significant changes in the labor market. And so I'll give you an example in one sort of post-industrial metro area in the Midwest. So over the last 12 months, tariffs on cars have gone up. As tariffs on cars have gone up, there are fewer cars being imported. As there are fewer cars being imported, there are fewer jobs in logistics. Logistics is traditionally most of the people who work in logistics are male. At the same time, there are a lot of jobs in healthcare and K to 12 teaching, K to 12 education. So we fill 1,000 K to 12 teacher jobs a year. We fill a lot of healthcare jobs each year. And so both K to 12 teaching and healthcare are traditionally majority female jobs. And so what we find is that when someone's let go from a job in logistics, they may never have considered a job in healthcare or teaching. They may be very happy and successful in those jobs, but I don't see themselves doing it because they don't have people who remind them of themselves doing those jobs. So what we do is we say to that individual, here are some jobs that are close by to your home, where you'd be happy and successful in the job. And if you're interested, we can route you in. And here are a variety of careers that you may not have considered, we can route you in. And then we're doing essentially the employer side of that on the employers that are hiring. So we say to the high school, Here's someone who would be a great teacher if only they got their teaching certification. They've never worked in teaching, but they actually have all the skills and they're happy and be happy and successful doing it. You should talk to them because they could be a really high performer in this 10th grade classroom. So I give you that context to explain that that is bias which exists on our part as individuals, which we can use something like AI to reduce. And we can reduce that AI, we can reduce that bias in a way that, that helps us as individual job seekers and helps us as employers to really make the right match, even though we may have perceptions about that match that may not be based on reality, but are based on sort of the limited information we know. So, just to wrap up before we get to questions, um, I um, I just sort of want to summarize sort of the power of using outcomes in this way to train models, and using outcomes across a lot of organizations, and a lot of employees, in order to make better predictions. What it lets us do is it lets us get beyond the challenge of an AI written resume. It allows us to get beyond the challenge of keyword matching as sort of the solution to our problems, which generally doesn't translate into the right productivity metrics we're looking for. It allows us to use those outcomes to hold vendors like Arena accountable for moving our metrics. So so it's one thing to say that that I'm going to use AI to automate an interview, and that's going to make things a little easier. It's another thing to use AI to say, okay, can I build my organization more effectively so that I can improve my retention, I can improve other productivity metrics, and I can measure those and report them out. Using these technologies, you can hold us and those like us accountable to those outcomes, because we're using them to train models, and you can monitor themselves, and we can report them to you in a way that you can actually measure our impact. It also makes it easier to figure out the friction and tax of these things. So so when we say, what does it cost us to do something? Using AI, we can determine those things more effectively, and that actually can help the relationship that traditionally has some friction in it between finance and human resources. Um, we can fill jobs a lot faster. So using technologies like this, you know, Arena is able to fill jobs that are hard to fill in typically something like 3 weeks. That is an incredibly impactful difference when we're trying to fill a job, particularly a hard to fill job. And we can look at large pools of people, we can look at outcomes associated with them, and we can route the right folks in. Um, and, and we are able to use these same technologies to monitor the results of this, to monitor how much less time we spend with jobs unfilled. We can monitor how much less churn we've got. We can monitor how much more efficient we're being with compensation. We can monitor a whole range of things and make predictions attached to it that allow us to make different decisions, that allow us to move the needle on things which just a few years ago were incredibly difficult to move the needle on. And even if we could, were incredibly difficult to prove that we had. So thank you for listening to the significance of what's going on in the world with AI and workforces and AI and labor markets, and how we at Arena are dealing with it, but more writ large, how we're thinking about, I think sort of what's possible and what's next with these technologies. So, Brittany, I will hand it to you if there are any questions from the audience.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for such an insightful presentation. As a reminder, audience members can still enter questions, and we'll go ahead and review a few that came through. This first question asks, if nearly 40% of core skills are set to change by 2030, how are you thinking about hiring for roles that may look very different in just a few years from now?
Uh, Thank you for that question. I think there's been a lot of conversation for a long time about skills-based hiring. And the idea behind skills-based hiring was that credentialing, looking at where someone went to school, was a very, very imperfect way of making decisions. So we started to look at skills, which are what skills does someone have today, And do those skills map to the job that I have to fill? But the challenge is that as those skills change at a very rapid clip, we need to tell a lot more about somebody just than what skills they've got. So in healthcare, where we do a lot of work, and when I say a lot of work, we have like 49% of all the nursing assistants in the United States are on our platform and 7% of all the registered nurses. So that's a lot. So the classic way of dealing with this in the setting of healthcare would be, does someone have a license? So does someone have a CNA license? Do they have an LPN license? Do they have an RN license? And obviously they need that. But there's a second set of issues which you need to monitor, and those are really sort of traits and behaviors. So we'll interact with a job applicant for 4 or 5 minutes. In that 4 or 5 minutes, we'll get a bunch of behavioral information. And then we can combine that behavioral information with the other information we've got on someone, including potentially what happened in their last job, to be able to map to how does someone perform in that job and do they stay, but even when those skills are changing at a very rapid clip. And so the classic way we would deal with this would be with, or the old school way of dealing with this would be with an assessment test. But the challenge with assessment tests was they were static and they didn't really use outcome data. And so AI allows us to take some of the science from assessment tests from decades ago, and really leapfrog it forward in a way that allows us to tie those outcomes to behaviors in a way that allows us to move beyond um, a simple, does someone have X skill today question. And that is really what allows us to deal with that rapid shift in skills required in different jobs.
Excellent, thank you. This next question asks, with AI written resumes and keyword matching becoming the norm, what signals do you actually trust anymore when evaluating potential and what feels increasingly outdated?
Well, that's a great question. I think I think to turn the question on its head a little bit, I think one of the things that we see in our data is that what we believe about a given resume doesn't necessarily tell you what you think it's telling you. So, for example, someone going to a particular school or having a particular major, um, you may think may tell you a particular thing, but you're interpreting it through your own bias of people you know who may have gone to that school or people you may know who had that major. Um, and um, and so I think that's sort of one category of these issues. Um, Another are things like, I'll give you an example. What does a break in employment mean? So, if you looked at someone who worked in a factory in the 1970s and you said this person had a break in employment, you might interpret that in a given way. But today, the nature of careers and employment is a little different. And so you may think that a break in employment may mean one thing, but it may mean something totally different. And with AI, we can actually get to the bottom of that. And so I think sort of one core lesson, which again, sort of turning the question on its head a little bit, is there is information in a resume, but it just may not be telling you what you think it's telling you. And AI can actually give you a better sense of what it's actually telling you. The other bucket of stuff which we consistently see signal in is behavioral information. So again, that 4 to 5 minutes we interact with a job applicant gives us a huge amount of information about how someone deals with stress, how someone deals with uncertainty, how someone reads the room, and each of these things are relevant. Now, they may not be relevant in the way that you as a hiring manager think they're relevant, but they just do tell you something. And so, in the parlance of data science, we say they have signal. And so we do find that we can trust some behavioral information that we collect, as long as we recognize that that behavioral information may not be telling us what we think it's telling us, and we are systematic about tying that information to an outcome in a way that holds ourselves accountable to the information we have that is trusted and tying it to an outcome in a way where we can measure whether or not we were right.
Great. Thank you, Mike. We have time for a couple more questions. So, this next question asks, what would it take for your organization to confidently hire someone who has never worked in your industry before, but has the behavioral traits and outcome data to thrive?
So I think part of this is, part of the question here um, is how do you determine someone who doesn't look like they should fill a job on paper, fill a job? And we have all kinds of perceptions about that. The person who's hiring for that 10th grade teacher may think that the person who worked in a distribution center is not the right fit. But what they may not know is that person who worked in a distribution center actually loves to read at night. And, you know, they have they have kids and nieces and nephews and love to read to those kids. And because of that, they have traits and behaviors and skills that would make them great in that job. And so what I would say is you need to essentially combine um, techniques of increasing the funnel with techniques that make it practical to increase the funnel. So, for example, in Maryland, so Maryland has about 6.5 million people in the state. The workforce in Maryland's a little bit over half of that. 278,000 people in Maryland are users of Arena or applied for a job on Arena, interact with Arena in some way. So that's a measurable portion of the workforce. If I am in a part of Maryland where I say, I would like to hire someone from a different industry, um, and I use a technology like Arena, but I don't sort that group. I just say, okay, just give me everyone who, is within a certain radius of my location. You could end up with 50 or 75,000 people. There's no way an individual can go through 50 or 75,000 people. So you need to basically increase the aperture while you create mechanisms to shrink the aperture. And so if you take the 50 to 75,000 people and say, okay, I want to sort this by people who, um, would be good in my job, would be likely to stay longer in my job, and, are interested in a new job and would be interested in the job I have to fill right now. That is something you can do pretty efficiently with AI. And so it allows you to increase the aperture, but then just look at the 30 people who maybe within a certain radius of your location who would be happy and successful and interested in the job and are likely to stay longer and perform better than your average employee. So it is the combination of those techniques that is what allows you to route folks from one industry to another more effectively.
Thank you so much for those insights. And I think this is a good question to close out with. Our last question. When you hear that companies are reducing turnover by 20% plus through outcome-based hiring models, what questions come to mind about fairness, compliance, and long-term performance?
So I think the key to evaluating that is you actually can measure whether or not you're reducing bias. You can actually measure not whether or not you're complying with the various rules that exist on these topics. And you need to hold the vendor, who's going to know more than you are about how their technology works, accountable to that. You also need to hold them accountable to the outcomes. So if you find that you're improving retention, but you're improving retention you know, by institutionalizing or introducing bias into a hiring process, it's not going to work. If you're reducing bias in a hiring process, but you're not improving retention, it's not going to work. But by using the outcomes on both of these fronts, you can hold vendors like us accountable. You can ask up front. You can put it into contractual terms. And on an ongoing basis, you can monitor it to ensure that not only are you improving your productivity metrics, but you're also complying with the law and you're reducing bias in a way that creates a better, more productive, and fairer workforce.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again, Michael, for such an insightful session. That is all the time we have for questions. And this does conclude today's webinar. So I also want to thank everyone for joining us today for this fantastic virtual event. And thank you again to our partner, Arena. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you.